Let's go now to CBS News Justice reporter Paula Reid, who is in our Washington bureau. So, Paula, you read the decision. What did the judges say in those opinions?
Elaine, the judges completely reject a central tenet of the White House's argument, which is that the president's decisions on national security are unreviewable. In this decision, the justices went line by line, and they said there is absolutely no precedent to suggest that the courts cannot review the president's decision. They went on to cite numerous Supreme Court cases where the high court has repeatedly reviewed these decisions, and they called this suggestion that the president's decision could not possibly be reviewed by the courts. They said it is contrary to the fundamental structure of democracy. So not a great sign for the White House's arguments going forward.
Well, how did the judges come down on legal standing for either side?
That's a great question, because in other cases, they have tried to attack anyone who has challenged this presidential executive order on standing. Standing is a fancy word for, do you have enough skin in the game to actually challenge this? And the White House has argued these states, they don't have standing to actually sue over this executive order. But here the courts looked at the state's arguments, and the state of Washington and fellow states, they argued that specifically their universities, interestingly, were impacted by this. They said that research dollars, they've already had to pay money to get new visas for some of their students. They went into very specific detail about how their colleges and universities were adversely impacted, and that the court found was sufficient to establish standing here.
And Paula, we already saw President Trump tweet, "See you in court. The security of our nation is at stake." So what is likely the next step in the process?
Well, frustratingly, he didn't say which court, which could have answered the big question, which is whether or not they're going to appeal this to the Supreme Court. That is an option that they have. They can appeal this temporary restraining order to the Supreme Court, argue their case that they should be able to continue to enforce the so-called travel ban while the courts hash out whether or not the policy is legal. But inevitably, he'll see them in court because it either goes to the Supreme Court or it goes back down to the district court. I just wish he had been more specific about which court.
Yeah, well, Paula, given that the president says safety is the chief concern with this policy, wouldn't it be faster to take back the executive order, fix it, and then reissue it?
Yes, that likely would be faster. It would almost inevitably also face some legal challenges and wind up in the court, but it may have had a greater chance of surviving this initial review and not being put on hold. I mean, if I was reviewing this just as a lawyer, you would probably counsel your client and say, look, I understand your objective is national security, but it is likely what you have come up with will not actually survive review at the Supreme Court. The judges said in this opinion, they said they have concerns about whether or not the White House will actually survive on the merits. And Elaine, that means they think that this could ultimately be struck down as being religious discrimination because they weren't that specific. It didn't seem narrowly tailored for national security. It seemed like a blanket ban over a group of countries that they couldn't really defend in court why they chose those countries. But with a few exceptions, carve out for green card holders, carve outs for people who had visas because they helped the U.S. military. A couple little revisions could have helped this policy ultimately survive at the high court, but it doesn't seem like the White House is willing to go back to the desk and redraft just yet.
All right, Justice reporter Paula Reid in Washington for us. Paula, thanks very much for your analysis.